So the project that I'm working on focuses on the fact of ethnic diversity in Mexico. Those who have been to Mexico know this. Most other people, including most Americans, don't. Mexico is an ethnically diverse country, particularly with indigenous citizens. And these are communities and individuals who are more or less directly descended from pre-Columbian peoples, Aztec. Everybody knows about the Aztec and the Mayan empires. Almost all Mexicans have some sort of mixed ancestry, but still to this day, maybe 10%, well, there are many different ways to try to quantify this, right? So probably a majority of the country has mixed ancestry. About 10% of the country can speak an indigenous language, languages that primarily are different from, but descended from ancient Aztec and Mayan languages. And there might be 1 million or maybe as many as 2 million Mexicans who don't really speak Spanish. I have to believe they speak it better than me, but they speak a variety of indigenous languages in the home and that kind of thing. Although those languages are falling away pretty quickly. I've had a long-standing interest in studying ethnicity in politics, and when I was in Mexico many years ago for dissertation research, I learned about a reform that happened in the state of Oaxaca in 1995 that was then called Usos y Costumbres. And I've been studying it so long that they've changed the name of what I study. In some quarters, that term has come to take on a negative connotation, and so the government and most advocates for indigenous rights now use this other term, which just means internal normative systems, right? Usos y costumbres is kind of hard to translate anyway, but it basically means indigenous rule or traditional type of practices. And what happened was that in 1995 in the state of Oaxaca, 418 out of the 570 municipalities in the state adopted this new form of rule that was made possible by a reform at the state level. So this is a multicultural reform. It's an autonomy reform. In most of these municipalities, indigenous communities were in fact governing themselves according to tradition and custom anyway, but this made it legal. And that gives an opportunity I should say too that most of those 418 communities were indigenous or indigenous minority, but not all. Some are not, and they adopted this autonomy anyway. If you know anything about Mexican politics, you're already thinking why that might be, right? And so the result that's interesting for me is that we have institutional variation within Oaxaca, across states, and an additional type of variation in the degree of formality, right? So some municipalities in Oaxaca are now effectively autonomous in a certain way. I can try to describe exactly what that means in a little more detail. Some are not. The institutions that are in place in Oaxaca are not replicated in other states within Mexico. And when indigenous communities adopt these traditional forms of rule, sometimes they do so legally and formally, as they have done in these cases in Oaxaca, and sometimes they do so informally, as in, for example, the neighboring state of Puebla, where I'm also doing research. I haven't said too much about what this new Usos y Costumbres system looks like, but just to say it real briefly, supposedly these indigenous communities have always governed themselves according to traditional institutions like public assemblies or councils of elders or whatever it might be. Sometimes women participate, sometimes women do not. There can be different rules about who's really a member of the community and who's not. And so what the reform did was recognize those indigenous authorities as the legitimate mayor, in effect, and local cabinet of the municipality. So there are, every 3 years when elections come around, there are not political parties, allegedly. They don't run campaigns. The parties don't nominate candidates. There's no secret ballot. Instead, the community will gather and discuss the different candidates until they arrive at a consensus. That can take days. Or the local authorities will be nominated in some other way. I can go into more detail about that if anybody has questions. But the research that I'm working on basically asks the question: what are the effects of this institutional change? This is a relatively radical intervention in terms of changing political institutions. There aren't very many cases in Latin America where this type of formal respect for multicultural institutions has been codified in law. And so it's a pretty big deal. It's been in place for 20 years. And if it has the effects that its original proponents said it would have, then by now, for sure, 20 years later, we should be able to see many effects. What kind of effects am I talking about? Well, number one, recognition of this traditional form of rule is supposed to be important for the protection of indigenous cultures. Right? I'll just mention them, but if anybody doubts any of this or has questions about how exactly it would work, please stop me and I'll discuss it. Second, many of these communities have for a long time been mired in political conflict, and advocates of multicultural reforms suggest that one reason for the conflict is that non-indigenous institutions like political parties and regular elections with a secret ballot were imposed on communities that didn't really share that tradition and didn't really have any respect for that type of political institution, and so that caused conflict. And it is a fact that in many of these communities in Oaxaca and other parts of southern Mexico, leadership selection every 3 years devolves into bullets. It's not uncommon, for example, for candidates or winning mayors to be shot. Certainly it's not uncommon for them to be shot at. And so the argument here is that a return to traditional political institutions will alleviate that type of political conflict. There's a third question, which is about female rights and minority rights, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. In some of these communities, women participate in politics. In others, they are forbidden from doing so. There have been a couple of high-profile cases. For example, one town in Oaxaca, maybe 10 or 12 years ago now, a woman won the mayoral election, but then after the election, the council of elders got together and decided that was illegitimate because women aren't supposed to participate in politics, and so they unseated her. And she went on to, she did okay for herself. She gained a bit of attention for that and eventually went into state and federal politics. But it highlights a very real concern, right? There's potential for conflict between respect for multicultural rights and respect for individual human liberties, right? And that's something that I really like about the project, which is that this gives us a real-world opportunity on the ground to try to see how those things play out. I love political philosophy too, but that's all in the clouds, right? This is an actual conflict that's relevant for understanding multiculturalism in modern democracy. fourthly, this is maybe a little bit more historically oriented, but there is a lot of suspicion that the reason for the original institutional change in 1995 had to do with the PRI's efforts to maintain power. So if you know anything about Mexico, you know that the PRI was the party in power for about 70 years, up through 2000. And in the 90s, it was starting to lose its grip on power. And so there are a variety of mechanisms that I could talk about if you're interested, where people think that this was a way to kind of nip the growth of the opposition in the bud. And of course, if you know a lot about Mexico, you'll recall that there was a rebellion, the Zapatista rebellion, in the neighboring state of Chiapas in 1994. And so there probably was some logic in Oaxaca by which the authorities thought, well, if we cede this reform to indigenous communities now, then we'll be able to avoid the kind of violent rebellion that they saw in the neighboring state. And then fifthly and finally, this was the particular topic that I chose to talk about today, although again, I'm happy to talk about any of these 5 issues, is the quality of governance. This might be have a similar logic to a couple of things I mentioned before, in that proponents of the multicultural reforms suggest that the imposition of what we would call standard electoral systems on indigenous communities creates a government that's not fitted to the culture of the people who live in those communities, and therefore the government in one way or another gets hamstrung. It increases corruption, maybe, or it creates leaders that don't have true legitimacy among the people, and so on and so on. And so the empirical implication of that is that we should observe in the municipalities that have turned towards multicultural institutions, that have gained this autonomy to do so, I should say, they should be better governed, right? And so that's something that I have a little bit of evidence on that I can share with you if you like. Any questions to this point, or should I keep going? Great.
Yeah. So Mexico has a federal system. Are there any policy areas that are at the federal level that are affecting these communities? You said that they were basically autonomous local municipalities, but are there any issues that sort of are federalized, that are different?
Yeah, so let me explain a little bit more what that means, because autonomy, when you see it used around the world in different settings, right, like I don't think they mean what the Kurds mean, right, when they talk about autonomy. The reason being is that the indigenous communities of Mexico don't have that, right, like the Kurds do. So autonomy in this setting just means freedom to use any other set of institutions other than what the Constitution specifies for local elections in order to select leadership. There are a couple other elements to it as well. For example, there are indigenous judges who operate at a kind of below the lowest formal level of the judiciary, and they'll settle disputes among indigenous citizens in the community. And they'll sometimes do things that would look a little bit weird to a U.S. constitutional scholar in terms of, habeas corpus and the right to representation and other things like that. But that's mostly at the lowest level. But these communities are still, in my study area in Oaxaca and Puebla, these communities are still fully linked into the government in terms of fiscal system and things like that. So almost all their budget comes from transfers from federal and state levels, so they're not really autonomous in a financial sense. There are still federal government offices like the local electoral office, which is where everybody gets their ID cards. The schools are still subsidized by by state and federal governments, and teachers typically are still members of the national teachers unions and stuff like that, right? That's not the case in some parts of Chiapas where autonomy really means autonomy, right? But in my study area, they're still pretty well linked in. Kathleen?
So, I'm hearing you say that kind of empirically, you can't see a great difference, that this experiment maybe has not been successful with the intent. But what about the perception of the people who are experiencing this kind of governance? Do they like it?
I think that there are some communities where a strong majority of the population takes pride in the institutions that they have. They believe in them. They think that their local governments are more legitimate. They're kind of fully invested. Sometimes this overlaps with language identity. So in some of these communities, the local teachers are like really excited about teaching indigenous languages again in the schools, right? This is a generational thing, right? There are lots of grandparents, 60, 70, 80-year-old who speak an indigenous language, and the younger generations just don't. And when I'm doing research there, they like to display that. So like the old people will talk to each other in front of me in Nahuatl or whatever, and the younger Mexicans are like, what? They don't understand it hardly any better than I do. They know a few words. So that's a real loss that a lot of those communities feel. And so in some of those communities, they're really pumped. The government helps them publish textbooks in indigenous languages, all with I don't know the proper name for it, with English letters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a little unnatural, but they, so they have textbooks and things like that. Other communities, not so much. So I'm one of the things that I'm struggling with is how to give like an aggregate answer to that question. Like how many of those municipalities are the first type and how many are the second type? I really don't know. But there are lots of communities I could tell you, if nobody has other questions, I will tell you interesting stories about how in the autonomous municipalities, it's actually caused more conflict, I think, in the municipalities that don't really have those traditions, but then were designated to be autonomous. It's a free-for-all, right? There's no, so in the Oaxacan Mixteca, where I've done some research, they basically, every 3 years when it comes time to do an election, the first thing that they have to do is sit down and have a fight about what the rules should be for the election, right? And sometimes that ends in bullets. So the election that happened shortly before I was there, this was a few years ago, they sat down to decide on the rules. They decided, or they had charged that 3 years ago people had been double voting and triple voting. So they said, okay, well the easy solution to that is to put the 3 urns out for the 3 candidates on a table in public and have people drop their credential into the urns. And since they do it in public, there's no way, well, you only have one credential, first of all, so you can't double vote, and there can't be any possibility of fraud because everybody's watching them. Well, you can imagine, right, what the effects of this are. And when it became clear through simple observation that one of the candidates was ahead, one of the other candidates got angry, made some charge of fraud, grabbed his urn and left. Right? So now that candidate has the credentials of everybody who voted for him, and and so that the state government had to come in and try to resolve that dispute, and that's even worse because the whole point here is for the state government to wash its hands. that's another part of the story at the state level of why they instituted this. The state government just saying like, you know, you figure it out. And so they were really at sea and without oversight. And when I met with the mayor to talk about this, I met with him in what I would describe as a bunker in the basement of the mayoral office, right? Because he does not sit near windows, right? And the previous mayor had been assassinated. And this is in an autonomous, right? So this is like happy indigenous people all, you know, living together type of things. In some cases that's really true. Those stereotypes are really true. But in this place it was not.